You have to understand, in the beginning they laughed. It was a cruel, confident laughter, born from the skies of Spain and Poland, France and the Low Countries. It was the laughter of men who believed they had already won the war and were merely cleaning up the remnants. And their laughter had a specific target in the spring of 1942. It was aimed at a rugged, angular American fighter plane and the inexperienced pilots who flew it. The German aces, the Experten, they looked at the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk and they saw a relic. They saw a joke. But wars are not won by the best dressed or the most elegant. They are won by the resilient, the adaptable, and the brutally effective. This is the story of how a plane dismissed as obsolete, a kitchen boy, as one German ace would sneer, became the instrument of their shock and terror over the scorching sands of North Africa. This is the story of how 6.50 caliber machine guns, when placed in the hands of determined American pilots, shredded the myth of German invincibility, one Bf-109 at a time. To truly grasp the scale of this upset, we need to step back into that world. Imagine the scene. The North African Theater, 1942. It's a brutal, dirty war, fought over a strip of coastline between the Mediterranean Sea and the vast, impassable Sahara. This isn't the war of hedgerows and forests, this is a war of dust. Fine, powdery, all-consuming dust that clogs engines, grinds down guns, and coats the throats of every soldier, sailor, and airman. The sun is a merciless adversary, the flies are a plague, and the front lines are a fluid, chaotic mess of armored thrusts and desperate defenses. And in this cauldron, two air forces clashed with profoundly different philosophies. The Luftwaffe, battle-hardened and led by legendary aces like the Star of Africa, Hans-Joachim Marseille, a pilot of such unnatural skill he could reportedly shoot down multiple enemies in a single, fluid pass. These men flew the Messerschmitt Bf 109F, the Friedrich. It was a masterpiece of German engineering, sleek, fast, and incredibly agile at high altitudes. It was a scalpel, designed for the delicate, deadly art of the aerial duel. The Bf 109 pilot was a knight, a jousting champion of the sky. Then, there was the American contingent. The Flying Tigers in China had already given the P-40 a fearsome reputation with their shark-mouthed tomahawks, but in North Africa, the U.S. Army Air Forces were the new kids on the block. Green, untested, and flying what the world had decided was a second-rate fighter. Let's talk about the P-40 Warhawk. It wasn't beautiful. Where the Spitfire was graceful and the Bf-109 was predatory, the P-40 was pugnacious. It had a big, blunt nose, housing a massive Allison V1710 liquid-cooled engine. That nose gave it a characteristic nose-down attitude on the ground, like a boxer leaning forward, eager for the fight. It was big. It was heavy. It was built like a middleweight brawler, not a fencer. And on paper, compared to the Bf-109F, it was inferior. Its major weakness was high-altitude performance. The Allison engine, without an advanced supercharger, lost power rapidly above 15,000 feet. The Bf-109 could climb higher and faster, dictating the terms of the engagement. This single fact was the source of the German mockery. They would simply climb above the P-40s, hold that altitude advantage, and then dive down in slashing hit-and-run attacks. It was the perfect tactic in theory. The P-40, they said, was a low-altitude dog, chained to the ground. One German ace, his name lost to time but his arrogance preserved in a pilot's diary, reportedly quipped that fighting the P-40 was like being challenged to a duel by a kitchen boy, all brute strength and no finesse, easy to outmaneuver and put down. That condescending nickname, Kitchen Boy, stuck in the minds of the American pilots. It wasn't just an insult to their machine, it was an insult to their skill, their courage, and their very presence in the war. But what the German aces failed to see, what their technological arrogance blinded them to, were the P-40's hidden strengths. That big, heavy airframe wasn't just a liability, it was incredibly robust. It could absorb a staggering amount of battle damage and still bring its pilot home. The cockpit was roomy and offered good visibility, a small but crucial comfort in the heat of battle. And then, there were the guns. 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. 3 in each wing. The .50 caliber round is not a bullet, it's a projectile. It's a half-inch thick, heavy, and when fired at a rate of over 800 rounds per minute per gun, it creates a cone of pure, concentrated destruction. Where German and British fighters often mixed rifle-caliber machine guns with slower-firing 20mm cannons, the P-40's armament was a sledgehammer. It didn't just pepper an enemy plane, it sawed it in half. At close range, those 6 guns unleashed a storm of lead that could dismantle a Bf-109 in seconds. The P-40 pilot didn't need to be a master marksman. He just needed to get close and, for a few seconds, hold the target in his sight. The man tasked with turning these kitchen boys into master chefs was a tough, no-nonsense officer named Colonel John "Joe" Cannon. He commanded the 57th Fighter Group, and he understood his plane and his enemy perfectly. He drilled his pilots relentlessly. He knew they could not fight the Luftwaffe's war. They could not climb to the Bf-109's altitude and engage in a turning duel. That was suicide. They had to invent their own way of war. And so, they developed what became known as the boom and zoom tactic. It was simple, brutal, and perfectly suited to the P-40's characteristics. Since they couldn't climb to the enemy, they would use the P-40's one key advantage: its phenomenal dive speed. That heavy airframe, once pointed downward, became a runaway freight train. It could dive faster and pull out of a dive harder than the lighter Bf-109. The tactic worked like this. They would fly at medium altitudes, often using the sun or haze for cover, acting as bait. When the German 109s, confident and sleek, would dive on them, the P-40s wouldn't try to turn and fight. They would brake, dive away, trading their altitude for even greater speed. Then, using that built-up velocity, they would zoom climb back up, turning the tables on the pursuing Germans. It was an energy-based fight, a game of aerial physics where the P-40's weight was an asset, not a flaw. They would boom down with guns blazing, and then zoom back up to safety. The early days, however, were a brutal learning curve. The diaries of pilots like Lieutenant James J.J. Megura of the 57th's 64th Fighter Squadron are filled with the frustration of those first encounters. He wrote, "They're like ghosts. You see a speck high above, and then a moment later, tracers are whipping past your canopy. By the time you turn, they're already climbing away. We're swinging a club at a wasp. We just can't connect." Losses were heavy. The confidence of the German aces seemed justified. They would rack up kills, their victory tallies growing, their legend solidifying. For the young American pilots, many of whom had never been in a dogfight before, it was terrifying. You're sitting in a cockpit, the engine roaring, the desert heat baking you alive, and you're scanning the sky until your neck aches, knowing that death could literally fall on you from the sun. The psychological toll was immense. They knew they were underestimated, and in those first weeks, they feared the Germans might be right. But Colonel Cannon and his veteran squadron leaders kept hammering the new doctrine. Don't turn with him. You turn, you die. Dive like you're trying to dig a hole to China. Build up your speed, then use it. Make one pass, make it count, and get out. They learned to fly in mutually supporting pairs, to watch each other's tails, to use the desert landscape itself for cover. They learned the subtle art of deflection shooting, aiming not at the enemy plane, but at the point in space where it would be when your bullets arrived. Slowly, painfully, the kitchen boys were learning their trade. And the Germans, blinded by their own success and superiority, failed to notice the change. They still saw the same clumsy-looking planes. They still expected the same predictable, desperate maneuvers. They didn't see the hardening resolve in the American squadrons. They didn't see the tactical evolution happening right under their noses. The laughter was about to die in their throats, replaced by the deafening roar of 6.50 caliber machine guns. Because the Americans were about to stop being the bait and start being the hunters. The stage was set for a collision that would shatter the Luftwaffe's confidence over Africa. The key battleground would be a strip of coast held by the British, a desperate port called Tobruk. And the men of the 57th Fighter Group were about to get their first real taste of vengeance. It would begin not with a grand battle, but with a single, furious encounter that would prove, once and for all, that the kitchen boy could throw a knockout punch. So what was that first decisive moment? When did the P-40 finally get its teeth into the legendary Luftwaffe? The story involves a young pilot from Pennsylvania, a near-empty fuel tank, and a choice between survival and glory, a story we'll uncover next time. The laughter didn't stop all at once. It didn't vanish in a single, thunderous clap. It was chipped away, piece by piece, in a series of brutal, close-range engagements that left the expertin baffled and bleeding. The turning point wasn't a grand, set-piece battle announced with trumpets. It was a slow, dawning realization in the cockpits of the Bf-109s that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. The kitchen boy had learned to fight back, and he was armed with a sledgehammer. It began in the skies over Tobruk. By the summer of 1942, the port city was a symbol of desperate resistance, a thorn in the side of Rommel's Afrika Korps. The air above it was a swirling, chaotic melee of bombers, fighters, and anti-aircraft fire. And it was here that the 57th Fighter Group's new tactics were put to the ultimate test. Picture Lieutenant James J.J. Megura, the same pilot who had written so despairingly of the German ghosts. He's crammed into his P-40's cockpit, the desert sun turning the metal surfaces into branding irons. He's sweating not just from the heat, but from the tension. Today is different. Today, the fear is still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it's been joined by something else, a simmering, focused anger. The taunts of the kitchen boy have festered. Today, he and his wingmen aren't just flying patrol, they're hunting. High above, a swarm of 4 Bf-109s, led by a veteran with a dozen kill rings painted on his tail, spots them. It's a familiar sight. The two clumsy P-40s, trudging along below. The German leader waggles his wings, the signal to attack. The confident, practiced dive begins. They are predators, and the Americans are their prey. But this time, the prey doesn't scatter. This time, Megura waits. He watches the specks grow into menacing shapes, the distinctive, squared-off wings of the 109s clear against the bleached-out sky. He waits until the last possible second, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, he shoves the stick forward and to the side. The P-40 doesn't just turn, it falls out of the sky. The G-forces press him into his seat, the engine screams, and the airframe shudders as he plunges into a near-vertical dive. The German pilots are momentarily confused. This is not the expected, panicked break. This is a violent, controlled evasion. They follow, their lighter 109s gaining, but not as quickly as they're used to. The P-40 is a rock in a well, and it's pulling away. Megura's wingman follows him down. They don't look back. They build up speed, the airspeed indicator needle pushing deep into the red. The desert floor rushes up to meet them in a blur of tan and brown. Then, at the bottom of the dive, Megura doesn't try to run. He uses that hard-won speed. He pulls back on the stick, the P-40 groaning under the strain, and begins a soaring, energy-rich zoom climb. He's trading speed for altitude now, arcing back up like a vengeful pendulum. And he's no longer the prey. He's the counterpuncher. The German pilots, committed to their dive, are now low, slow, and vulnerable. They've lost their precious altitude advantage. As they pull out, struggling to regain energy, they find the two P-40s above them, diving back down with all the momentum they just built. It's a complete reversal. Megura picks the trailing 109. He doesn't fiddle with his sights. He gets close. 300 yards. 200. He can see the swastika on the tail, the mottled desert camouflage. He feels a cold clarity. He thumbs the trigger. And the world dissolves into sound and fury. The 6.50 caliber machine guns don't go rat-a-tat-tat. It's a deeper, more visceral sound, a deafening, ripping buzz that shakes the entire airplane. It's the sound of a massive canvas being torn apart by giants. A stream of tracer fire, glowing red, reaches out and envelopes the Messerschmitt. At this range, the effect isn't subtle. Pieces fly off the 109's wings and fuselage. The cockpit plexiglass shatters. A flash of orange and black erupts from the engine cowling. In seconds, the sleek, predatory machine is a falling, burning wreck. Megura doesn't watch it hit the ground. He's already breaking away, scanning for the next threat, his wingmen covering him. The other German pilots, stunned by the sudden, brutal loss of their comrade, break off the attack and scatter. The fight is over. It was short, violent, and utterly decisive. Back on the ground, the mood in the 57th's tent was electric. Megura's confirmed kill was more than just a number on a scoreboard. It was vindication. It was proof that their tactics worked. That the P-40, in the right hands, in the right situation, was a killer. The myth of the Bf-109's invincibility had been punctured. And it kept happening. Not every day and not without cost. The Luftwaffe was still a deadly opponent. But the Americans were learning, adapting, and growing more confident with every engagement. They developed new tricks. They learned to use the P-40's ruggedness aggressively. A pilot could dive through a formation of enemy planes, take a few hits, and keep fighting. A Bf-109, with its more delicate airframe and liquid-cooled engine vulnerable to a single bullet, could not. The psychological shift was profound. Listen to the diary of a different pilot, Lieutenant Robert L. Punchy Powell, from later that summer. Saw 3 109s high at 6 o'clock. Gave the signal and we dove for the deck. They took the bait like trout to a fly. Led them right over the deck, boys. As we zoomed back up, the sky around them turned black with flak. Saw one take a direct hit. Wings came off. Felt a savage kind of joy. They're not ghosts anymore. They're just targets. The Americans were no longer just reacting. They were thinking, planning, and using the entire environment as their weapon. They used dust storms for concealment. They used the glare of the sun for ambushes. They became masters of the low-altitude brawl, the one fight the high-flying 109s were ill-equipped to win. And the German aces? At first, they dismissed these losses as flukes. Bad luck. The incompetence of a junior pilot. But as the kill ratios began to even out, a note of confusion, then frustration, crept into their own accounts. Hans von Marseille, the unparalleled ace, remained lethally effective, but even he noted the changing nature of the fights. In a letter to a fellow pilot, he wrote, "The Amos in their Curtiss machines are becoming more clever. They do not climb with us. They force us to come down into the dust and smoke, and they are stubborn. It is an ugly fight, not a clean one." That was the heart of it. The Americans had rejected the Luftwaffe's idea of a clean fight. This wasn't a chivalrous joust in the pristine upper air. This was a back-alley knife fight in the dirt, and the P-40 was the biggest, toughest knife on the block. The Germans, with their superior technology and tactical doctrine, had tried to impose their game on the Americans. The Americans had simply changed the game. The P-40's reputation began to transform. From a joke, it became a workhorse. From a liability, it became a weapon. The ground crews, the unsung heroes who kept these complex machines flying in the most abysmal conditions, took immense pride in their Hawks. They saw the battle damage they could survive. They saw the shredded enemy aircraft confirmed by gun cameras. A new culture of grim confidence settled over the American squadrons. But the greatest test was yet to come. The Luftwaffe, stung by these setbacks and desperate to achieve air superiority for Rommel's final push towards Egypt, was about to commit its reserves. The skies would darken with German aircraft. The pressure on the outnumbered P-40 squadrons would become immense. They had proven they could win individual duels. But could they win a battle of attrition? Could they stand against an aerial armada? The answer would come on a single, epic day. A day that would burn the name of the P-40 Warhawk into the history of the Luftwaffe forever. A day the Americans would call Palm Sunday. A day of such scale and slaughter that it would dwarf every engagement that had come before. The kitchen boys were about to be thrown into the fire of a true, massed aerial battle. And the world would watch, holding its breath, to see if they would emerge triumphant or be consumed. What happened on that fateful Palm Sunday? How did a handful of P-40 squadrons confront one of the largest air fleets the Luftwaffe ever sent over Africa? The story of that day is one of sheer, unadulterated carnage, a turning point not just in the Desert War, but in the very soul of the American Air Force. The stage is set. The players are in position. The hammer is about to fall. April 18, 1943. Palm Sunday. A day of peace, of reflection. But in the skies over the Mediterranean, just off the coast of Cape Bon, Tunisia, there would be no peace. Only a massacre. The tide of the North African campaign had turned. The Allies had Rommel's Afrika Korps and the remaining Italian forces cornered in a shrinking pocket in Tunisia. Their only hope was a desperate, massive airlift of men and supplies from Sicily. The Luftwaffe assembled a huge fleet of transport aircraft, hulking, slow junkers Ju-52s, the anti-Ju-s, along with some of the larger, six-engine Messerschmitt Me 323 Gigants. They were to be protected by a strong escort of Bf-109s and deadly Bf-110 heavy fighters. It was a gamble of epic proportions, a final, colossal effort to stave off total defeat. Allied intelligence, thanks in part to the top-secret ultra-code-breaking operation, knew it was coming. They knew the route, the timing, the scale. And they prepared a reception committee. A wall of Allied fighters was vectored to intercept the lumbering air armada. And at the forefront were the P-40 Warhawks of the U.S. 57th, 79th, and 324th Fighter Groups. The scene that day was almost biblical in its scale and horror. Imagine you're a young P-40 pilot, climbing into your cockpit in the pre-dawn chill. There's a tense energy in the air, a feeling that today is different. The briefing was stark. A huge enemy formation is coming. Your job is to get low, get in among the transports, and destroy them. Leave the enemy fighters to the Spitfires and others flying top cover. You are the butcher, not the duelist. You take off, your flight joining dozens of others, a vast swarm of Allied air power heading out over the blue water. And then you see it, a sight that you will carry with you for the rest of your life. On the horizon, a dark, sprawling cloud. But it's not a weather front. It's moving, pulsating. As you get closer, the cloud resolves into individual shapes. Dozens, then scores, then hundreds of enemy aircraft. It is the entire Luftwaffe transport fleet, a sky train of vulnerability stretching for miles. It's the most target-rich environment any fighter pilot could ever dream of or nightmare of. The German escorts, the Bf-109s, are weaving nervously above their charges. They are outnumbered, overwhelmed by the sheer number of Allied fighters descending from all directions. The sky becomes a madhouse, a swirling, chaotic, three-dimensional battlefield. Tracers lace the air in every direction. The booming crump of aerial cannon shells, the sharper crack of machine guns, the roar of hundreds of engines. It's a symphony of destruction. And into this maelstrom, the P-40s dive. They don't bother with the high-altitude 109s. They point their noses down and plunge straight for the heart of the formation, the slow, defenseless Ju-52s. This is the moment the P-40 was born for. This is not a delicate dogfight. This is a turkey shoot. Lieutenant Jerry Collinsworth of the 57th Group later described it in a letter home. "We hit them like a thunderbolt. I lined up on a Ju-52, it was so big I couldn't miss. I thumbed the trigger and my 6 guns just ate him. Pieces flew off his wing, then the whole wing just folded up and he went down in a spiral. I pulled up, rolled over, and picked another one. It was like shooting ducks in a barrel. They were everywhere. I saw one P-40 pilot fly so close to a Ju-52 that when it exploded, his plane was tossed upside down by the blast. He recovered and shot down another one." The P-40's 6.50 caliber Brownings were the perfect tool for this slaughter. The Ju-52s, built of fabric and metal tubing, were horrifically vulnerable. A 1-second burst would shred them. They disintegrated in midair. Paratroopers, meant to reinforce a doomed army, tumbled out of the shattered fuselages, their parachutes fluttering open only to be set on fire by the burning fuel and debris raining down. The sea below, a beautiful, tranquil blue, became a churning oil-slicked graveyard of wreckage and bodies. The German pilots were helpless. The Bf-109s, designed for agility and high-altitude combat, were utterly unsuited to this kind of close-quarters, low-altitude brawl. They were fast, but they couldn't protect the massive formation from the swarming, heavily armed P-40s. To try and intervene was to be swarmed themselves by the higher-flying Spitfires. It was a tactical disaster of the highest order. One pilot from the 324th Group, Lieutenant Ken Doc Bush, found himself in a surreal duel. He was hammering a Ju-52 when a Bf-109 dove on him. Instead of breaking away, Bush held his course, pouring fire into the transport until it blew apart. Then, using the energy from his dive, he executed a high-G zoom climb that brought him right up under the diving 109. The German pilot, expecting the P-40 to flee, was caught completely off guard. Bush fired a deflection shot from almost straight up. The 109 flew right through the stream of .50 caliber rounds. It simply came apart. This was the ultimate validation of the boom and zoom tactic applied on a mass scale. The P-40s would dive, fire, and then use their dive speed to climb back to safety, only to dive again. They were relentless. They were sharks in a feeding frenzy. The statistics from that day are staggering, almost incomprehensible. In what became known as the Palm Sunday Massacre, Allied fighters shot down over 90 German aircraft. The 57th Fighter Group alone was credited with 28 confirmed kills. The 324th got 14. The P-40 squadrons were responsible for the vast majority of the transport planes destroyed. It was one of the most one-sided aerial victories of the entire war. But beyond the numbers, the psychological impact was total. For the German pilots who survived, it was a trauma from which the Luftwaffe in Africa never recovered. The diary of a Bf-109 pilot who escorted that doomed mission was recovered. His entry is haunting. It was a flying hell. The Amos were everywhere. They came through our formation like demons, their guns tearing our transports to pieces. We could do nothing. Nothing. I saw 3 Ju-52s go down in as many seconds. The sea was on fire. We have lost everything. The air, the hope, everything. For the Americans, Palm Sunday was a baptism by fire that forged an unshakable identity. The P-40, once the mocked kitchen boy, was now the shark-mouthed killer. The pilots who flew them were no longer green replacements. They were hardened veterans, aces. They had not only stood against the best the Luftwaffe had to offer, they had annihilated them. The myth of German aerial superiority was dead, shot down over the Mediterranean and left to sink beneath the waves. The victory was so complete, so devastating, that it effectively ended the Luftwaffe's ability to sustain its forces in North Africa. The Axis surrender in Tunisia just a few weeks later was a direct consequence of the Palm Sunday massacre. The P-40 and its pilots had not just won a battle, they had helped win a campaign. But war is a relentless teacher. Even in victory, there were signs of change. The P-40 had proven its worth in the low-altitude, tactical war of North Africa. Yet, everyone knew that newer, more advanced American fighters were on the way. The P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the P-51 Mustang. These were planes designed to take the fight to the enemy at high altitude, to escort bombers deep into Germany, to win the war in the air on a global scale. So, what was the legacy of the rugged, pugnacious Warhawk? Was its triumph at Palm Sunday its final, glorious act? Or did it have one more crucial role to play in the final, bloody chapters of the war? The story of the P-40 wasn't over. It was simply moving to a new, even more brutal theater, where its particular set of brutal skills would be needed once more. A theater where the enemy was different, the conditions were worse, and the stakes were just as high. The Pacific was calling. The Palm Sunday Massacre was the P-40's symphony, its masterpiece. But the war wasn't over. And this rugged, adaptable fighter, having proven its worth in the desert, was now needed in the vast, sprawling theater of the Pacific. This was a different war entirely. Distances were measured in oceans, not deserts. The enemy was the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, pilots bound by a code of Bushido, flying agile, lightweight fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M0. And once again, the experts, the pundits, the armchair strategists, made a fatal miscalculation. They looked at the Zero and saw a plane of almost mythical agility. They looked at the P-40 and saw, well, the same old kitchen boy. They were about to make the same mistake the Germans had. The Zero was a revelation in the early days of the Pacific War. It could outturn any Allied fighter. It had a phenomenal range. It was, on paper, a superior dogfighter. American pilots trying to duel with it in the classic, turning fight were slaughtered. The same sense of despair that had gripped the pilots in North Africa now infected the squadrons in the Philippines, in Java over Guadalcanal. But just as in Africa, a group of tough, thinking pilots looked at their machine, looked at the enemy, and refused to play his game. The leader of this revolution was a man named Claire Lee Chennault. A brilliant, maverick tactician, he had already been training his American volunteer group, the legendary Flying Tigers, in China to fight the Japanese. And his doctrine for the P-40 against the Zero was a carbon copy of the lessons learned over the Sahara, just refined for a new enemy. Chennault's mantra was simple: never, ever turn with a Zero. The Zero's incredible agility came at a cost. It was lightly built. It had no armor plating for the pilot. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was a samurai sword, razor-sharp, but brittle. The P-40 was a battle axe, heavier, slower to swing, but capable of delivering a blow that would shatter the sword. The tactics were familiar: boom and zoom. Use the P-40's superior dive speed and structural strength to make slashing hit-and-run attacks. The P-40 could dive away from a Zero with ease. A diving P-40 was a ghost, vanishing from the Zero pilot's sight. Then, using that speed, it could climb back for another pass. The goal was to get in close, let the 6.50 calories do their work, and get out. A single, solid burst was often enough to turn the fragile Zero into a fireball. Over Guadalcanal, in the bitter, grinding campaign for Henderson Field, these tactics became a matter of life and death. The Cactus Air Force, a ragged collection of Marines, Navy, and Army Air Forces pilots flying from a muddy, bomb-cratered airstrip, held the line against overwhelming Japanese air and naval power. And their primary fighter was the P-40. Picture a young Marine pilot, Captain Marion Carl, a future ace. He's flying a worn-out P-40, its paint faded by the tropical sun and salt spray. He's exhausted, living on canned food and adrenaline, fighting off malaria and daily air raids. A swarm of Zeros comes in, their pilots confident, eager for a fight. Carl doesn't climb to meet them. He waits. He lets them commit. Then he leads his flight in a diving slashing attack. He picks a Zero, dives on it, fires a 2-second burst. The Zero, hit by the sledgehammer .50 cal rounds, simply disintegrates. Carl doesn't watch the pieces fall. He's already diving for the deck, a pair of Zeros on his tail. He stays low, using the P-40's ruggedness to skim the jungle treetops, leading his pursuers into the waiting guns of the American anti-aircraft defenses. The P-40 wasn't just a fighter, it was a system, a key part of a desperate, integrated defense. The diaries of Japanese pilots from this period reveal a growing frustration. They speak of the American pilots refusing to dogfight. They speak of the terrifying durability of the P-40, how it could take dozens of 7.7mm rounds and keep flying, while a few .50 caliber hits were fatal. They had a nickname for the P-40 too. They called it the tough guy. It was not a term of endearment, it was a grudging acknowledgement of a formidable, frustrating opponent. This was the ultimate legacy of the P-40 Warhawk. It was the plane that taught the American Air Forces how to win when they were outclassed. It was the crucible in which the tactical DNA of the USAF and US Navy was forged. The lessons learned in its cockpit, the emphasis on energy fighting, on section tactics, on using a plane's strengths and exploiting an enemy's weaknesses, became the bedrock of American fighter doctrine for the rest of the war. When the more advanced P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s arrived in theater, their pilots weren't starting from scratch. They were building on a foundation of hard-won experience paid for in blood by the men who flew the P-40. The boom and zoom tactics perfected against the Bf-109 and the Zero were directly applied to the Lightning, the Thunderbolt, and the Mustang. The P-40 was the schoolhouse. And its service didn't end there. It became the Lend-Lease workhorse, supplied in the thousands to the Soviet Union, where its ruggedness and heavy armament made it a favorite on the Eastern Front for ground attack. It served with the Royal Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, and countless other allied nations. It was everywhere, a testament to its fundamental, brutal utility. So, what's the final verdict on this kitchen boy? The P-40 Warhawk was never the best fighter of World War II. It wasn't the fastest. It wasn't the most maneuverable. It wasn't the highest flying. But it might just have been the most important. It was the right plane at the right time. In 1941 and 1942, when the Allies were on the ropes, when the future of freedom hung by a thread, the P-40 was there. It was available. It was tough. And it was deadly. It held the line in the deserts of Africa, in the skies over Guadalcanal, in the frozen wastes of Russia. It bled the Luftwaffe and the Imperial Japanese Air Forces dry, buying the precious time needed for the war-winning weapons to arrive. But more than that, it taught a generation of American pilots how to fight and how to win. It taught them that courage wasn't enough, that you needed brains, that you needed to be clever, to be adaptable, to be resilient. The spirit of the P-40 is the spirit of the underdog who refuses to quit. It's the spirit of the boxer who might not be the most technically skilled, but who has a heart as big as a lion and a punch that can knock out any opponent if he can just land it. The German aces who mocked it, the Japanese pilots who feared it, they all made the same fatal error. They judged the machine by its specifications on a page. They failed to account for the most critical variable of all, the indomitable will of the American pilot sitting in the cockpit. The man who, when told his plane was obsolete, would just grin, pat the fuselage and say, "She'll do." The P-40 story is a powerful reminder that victory is not always about having the best technology. It's about having the right tool, the right tactics, and above all, the right spirit. It's a story of American ingenuity, of grit, of the refusal to accept a predetermined fate. So, the next time you face a challenge, the next time someone tells you that you or your tools aren't good enough, remember the P-40 Warhawk. Remember the kitchen boys of the 57th Fighter Group diving out of the sun over Tobruk. Remember the desperate pilots of the Cactus Air Force holding the line at Henderson Field. Remember that underestimation is a weapon you can hand to your enemy or one you can use to bludgeon them. It's a choice. They laughed at the kitchen boy until his 6 guns shredded their best. Let that be a lesson for the ages. So, where does that leave us? After this journey across the deserts of Africa and the jungles of the Pacific, what is the final, lasting echo of the P-40's roar? It's easy to look at the cold, hard statistics of World War II aviation and dismiss the Warhawk. By the numbers, it was obsolete. It was outclassed. It should have been a footnote, a plane that was there at the beginning, to be quickly replaced by something better. But history isn't written solely by spreadsheets and performance charts. It's written in the heat of the moment, by the choices made under fire, by the raw, unyielding spirit of those who refuse to lose. The P-40's true victory wasn't just in the kill counts over Cape Bon or the skies of Guadalcanal. Its victory was philosophical. It proved a concept that would become the bedrock of the American way of war. Adapt, improvise, overcome. Think about it. The Germans had the perfect fighter for their doctrine. The Japanese had the perfect fighter for theirs. They built their strategies around a specific, idealized form of combat. They were rigid. The Americans, thrown into a global conflict with a tool that was, by all accounts, inadequate, were forced to be flexible. They couldn't rebuild their plane, so they rebuilt their tactics. They looked at their flaws and turned them into strengths. That heavy airframe? A diving advantage. The lack of high-altitude power? An excuse to force it began in the skies over Tobruk. By the summer of 1942, low-level fight where they held the cards. They didn't complain about the hand they were dealt. They learned to play it better than anyone thought possible. This is the legacy that echoes far beyond the war. It's the same spirit that took us to the moon with less computing power than a modern car key. It's the spirit that innovates in garages and startups, challenging corporate giants. It's the belief that heart and brains can triumph over sheer resources and established power. The men who flew the P-40, the James Maguras, the Marion Carls, the countless unknown pilots whose names are lost to time, they weren't just pilots. They were problem solvers. Every time they strapped into that cockpit, they were conducting a live-fire experiment in survival. They were proving that will is a weapon system. The 6.50 caliber guns were just the delivery mechanism. And what of the arrogance of the aces? The German expertin who sneered at the kitchen boy, the Japanese pilots bewildered by the tough guy that wouldn't play by their rules? Their story is the oldest cautionary tale in the book. It's the story of Goliath, confident in his size and his spear, unable to comprehend the threat from a sling and a stone. It's the story of the Titanic, deemed unsinkable, meeting its fate with a single, overlooked iceberg. Underestimation is a poison. It clouds judgment, breeds complacency, and creates blind spots that become fatal. The Luftwaffe and the Imperial Japanese Navy looked at the P-40 and saw what it wasn't. They failed to see what it was: a rugged, reliable, and brutally effective platform in the hands of a resourceful and determined pilot. That's the final, powerful lesson of the Warhawk. It's not about the machine. It never is. It's about the human spirit inside it. The P-40 was a physical manifestation of the American spirit in those dark early days of the war. Tough, unpretentious, maybe a little ungainly, but incredibly hard to kill, and packing a hell of a punch when it finally got its chance. Today, you can find P-40s in museums. They sit, silent and polished, their war paint restored. You can walk up to one, look at its blunt nose, its wide wings. It doesn't have the sleek, timeless beauty of a Spitfire. It doesn't have the raw, powerful presence of a Mustang. But if you look closely, if you listen to the silence, you can almost hear it. The roar of the Allison engine. The ripping canvas sound of 6 Brownings firing in unison. The defiant shouts of pilots who turned a supposed liability into a legend. They laughed at the kitchen boy. They called him obsolete, a relic, a joke. But the kitchen boy didn't need their approval. He just needed one good shot. And when he took it, he didn't just take out a machine gun nest. He took out an entire doctrine of arrogance. He proved that on any given day, with the right plan and enough courage, the underdog can and will have its day. That's a story that never gets old. That's a truth that resonates far beyond any battlefield. It's the story of the P-40 Warhawk. A plane that wasn't the best, but was, perhaps, exactly what we needed it to be.